Well, thanks, Josh, for this. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my knowledge and images with you today. I'm going to be reading. I have notes. What you see is not, in terms of text, is not nearly what I have written in front of me. So I will be probably reading as much as I speak directly to you. So please forgive me if it sounds a little bit like I'm talking down. But let me talk a little bit about what this project is about, as Josh mentioned. I call it the Early Light Project. I've been I just took an interest one day. I was at an antique store and saw an old photograph. It was a picture of King Edward VIII giving a medal to a gentleman in Halifax, and I said, who took this picture? It actually said something. It said Commercial Photo Service. I said, who was actually behind the camera? And that got me into the. And I asked the vendor who I was about to buy the picture from, and he said he didn't know. He'd never seen any information about that. It turns out there was a lot of material, like what Josh was doing, like most of the archivists around the region have some sort of a list, if you will, of who the photographers were. Even the Library and Archives Canada has a very large list, but I realized that there was an opportunity to do something for this region, and I thought it would be interesting to see what would happen if we looked at it from a region. I just felt that maybe there's maybe one shot at it, one chance to look at the whole region, and I think it has paid off because you'll see some examples of why here. So in doing that, I've had the luxury of having some really good collaborations with people like Josh, with the rooms in St. John's, Newfoundland, with the Nova Scotia Archives, with the New Brunswick Museum, and so on. John Boylan over at the Public Archives in Charlottetown, for example. If you're interested in following, usually, I guess they see a presentation like this, you have the Facebook page at the end. There's the Facebook page right now, the Early Light Project. You can go on there. For the past 2 years, I just finished doing a one posting a week where we were following the first 100 years of photography. Yeah, another week, another year. And I would admit it was quite exhausting, but it was really quite interesting to develop a conversation with different readers. I was up to about 600 likes and follows during that period. So my main project has been to develop a biographical dictionary for use by other researchers, but out of that has been this sort of just a general history interest. I've been working you first have to identify that there was a photographer, then to document them. And so that's what's going into the biographical dictionary. So the next question that you may be asking is why this period, and why call this area the cradle of photography? Let me just talk about why this period in particular. In this 25-year period, in the years leading up to Confederation, which 1864 is exactly 160 years ago, we went through 4 discrete processes: the daguerreotype, what's known as the Talbot type, which was an early negative-based process, something called an ambrotype, which I'll introduce you to if you're not already familiar with it, to the ferrotype, which is also known as a tintype, and then a return to the early Talbot process, which was a negative positive based photography process. So in a way, photography in those first 25 years was kind of like cellular phones in this century, when we went from the rapid, the big brick going into the flip phone, going into smartphones, and then now becoming a ubiquitous thing. It was that disruptive, if you will. And why this picture? this is really illustrative of why we can claim to be the cradle of photography in Canada. The picture is actually modern. It was made by a collaborator of mine in Halifax named Dale Wilson, who was a professional photographer for many years. And then as professional photographer kind of went the way of journalism, a lot of journalism, unfortunately. He decided to get into the early processes of photography, going back to the original description of Talbot. I mean, if you're not familiar with Talbot, he was one of the early experimenters in photography in England. His name was Henry Fox Talbot, is often referred to. And he invented what's called the sun print, where he basically sensitized paper and would put something on it like a fern leaf, as you see here, and found a way, just originally using salt water, to actually stop the process. And there he immediately had a negative picture of a fern leaf. What he discovered quite readily was, if he was to actually re-expose that fern leaf to sunlight against another piece of sensitized paper, he could actually get a positive version of it. But because he was working with paper against paper, and paper had texture and thickness and so forth, it was rather imperfect. But he went and carried on with research afterwards, after announcing this early process, and was able to finally have success in the negative positive process that I'll talk about in a little bit. So why is it relevant to our area? Because, as it says there were 4 newspapers in the spring of 1839 who all announced the process and went to some length to describe it, including the Kingston Gazette, Quebec Gazette, Toronto Patriot, and Colonial Pearl, which was based in Halifax. It was the Colonial Pearl that, a week after the publication, the editor wrote, "One of our friends who read the article in last week's issue has since formed several photographic pictures with ease and success." So that's the first documented evidence we have of a photograph being made in British North America. And there's been no one to dispute that. And so until somebody comes up with a better record, that will stand. So that's not the only claim, though, and I'm going to get to another one in a minute. What was going on before photography? In the area in the early 19th century before photography, there was a great deal of interest in having your portrait made. There may have been some discussion in the general public of progress in photography, but I'm not that sure. Really, it was, but there was more wealth being generated through the Industrial Revolution and so forth. And so portrait makers were quite common for the wealthier people. They would do miniature portraits often, and they were often made on ivory. The one you see in the example here is in the Nova Scotia Archives collection, and you can actually see there's been a bit of slippage in the frame. That white vertical line is the ivory. And this gentleman, his name is actually Portland, and I think he was from English nobility. He was here for some years in the 1830s, and then returned to England, but left the picture with somebody who later passed it on to the archives. You'll notice that the picture is mounted in a case, and that's a brass mount around it. And it's interesting. You'll see that type of presentation common into photography. A couple of other portrait painters, a gentleman named William Valentine, another named John Stevenett Clow. You can see an example of a Clow portrait miniature in the middle there. Those are both English gentlemen. There's a little ad that showed up in a newspaper, I think in Charlottetown 50 years ago, is little ditty. I'll try to read it here. This is the way it was bound to look when grandfather had his picture took. These were the shadows cast before the coming of conjurer de Gur. So Daguerre is actually how I pronounce it, but it rhymes right that way. But that was the other option, was to have a silhouette taken. We often think about the silhouette as the most common form of early portraiture. But I think what was characteristic of a lot of it, it was miniature, because it was relatively inexpensive. In New Brunswick, a couple of interesting people were active as portraitists. One was Robert Fallis, who you're probably most familiar with as the inventor of the foghorn. He was also a metal founder and also a builder of steamships. The second steamship to travel the St. John River up to Fredericton here was from was Fallis. So he was quite important in many ways, but he was a very competent artist in his own right. You can see at the top are these two medallions, or bas relief medallions. They're about that big, very small, but gorgeous. And bas relief is low relief. These are high relief. It's probably about a centimeter above the shoulders there. Another was a gentleman named Thomas Hanford Wentworth, who had New Brunswick roots, was born in America, but spent time here and then returned to America, where he died in the around 1850, I believe. I mention these because they're going to come back into the story in a minute. So the first, so we've already discussed the announcement of the Talbot process that happened in May, but in August, and Talbot made the announcement because he knew that this announcement was coming later on in the year. This is a gentleman named Louis Daguerre from France, who was announcing a second, completely different kind of photographic process, which became known as the daguerreotype. He had been experimenting with the photographic process with another gentleman named Niepce in France since the 1820s, but it was in 1939 that he was able to be secure enough with the invention to announce it. What was really remarkable then, as in now, was that the French government understood the importance of this photographic process, a completely new process using light and chemicals, to purchase the rights to it and put it into the public domain, generally everywhere except for England, because England and France were still kind of, at loggerheads. That was significant, actually, for the development of the Talbot process, because you could actually use Daguerre's process in England, but you had to purchase the rights. Elsewhere, it was free. All you had to do was buy a copy of his instruction manual, and you were off to the races. It was quite a complicated instruction manual, and interestingly, Daguerre himself thought it would never be possible to create a portrait because it took so long exposure time. Well, within a year, and once the idea, the methodology had crossed the Atlantic, there were people taking pictures, and that's a very early one. This one actually is in the Nova Scotia Archives collection. It's believed to have been taken in New York in mid 1840. So that's less than 6 months after, I believe it. The instruction manual arrived in September, October, and here we are in the mid 1840 with someone with the studio in New York City. And our only speculation is that gentleman probably was a Nova Scotian who was down in New York and decided to have his picture taken. It's kind of an unusual picture in that you're seeing him in profile. He had to be in profile, and you can also sense that probably the background is very close to his head, just the way the shadows seem to work there. And basically, because of there was fairly low, I guess we call it now ISO, the actual the amount of light that the plate had, and I'm going to talk about the plate mechanism in a minute, but it just took a lot of light and a lot of time to create the picture. So he probably had his head stabilized against the back wall, and there was a light that was projected through a mirror onto his face, which would have been very difficult to look at. So that's why he's looking away from the camera. But they proved that yes, you could take take portraits, and that was where the money was, and so that's where all the effort was placed. So, but also in that same year, the first photograph ever made in no, not the first in British North America. There was an early photograph taken of Niagara Falls that was discovered a few years ago. This, though, is an interesting project that was undertaken during the border dispute in the 1840s. And the Americans wanted to have wanted to have evidence of what was up in the disputed area between Quebec, New Brunswick, and Maine. And this gentleman, Edward Anthony, who would have a long career in photography afterward, had been an earlier experimenter, made his own camera out of a cigar box. But the engineer who was the survey engineer who was hired by the Americans to actually go up to Maine to do the survey said, "Why don't you come up there with some daguerreotype plates and take pictures?" He brought 100 with him. Those plates have not survived, but watercolors based on them have. This one is called View on Lower Patawamakejik Lake, looking north from the upper part. I believe it's somewhere south of in the Restigouche area. And if you say, well, that just looks like a watercolor painting, it's when you look at the mount that these are placed on. And here's another example. This is called daguerreotype view from Montaigne de Biort, bearing north by northeast, something to that effect. So it's clear that they were derived from daguerreotypes taken in October, September 1840. I just talked about how slow the camera was. So was there an actual moose in that was captured by the daguerreotype? We may never know, but I suspect if it was, he was probably quite blurry. So who were the first people to actually try to make money in this region out of photographs, out of daguerreotypes? We have knowledge of a Mrs. Fletcher from Newburyport, Massachusetts, who came with her husband here, and she was a known experimenter with daguerreotypes. She was here in July, August 1841. No evidence she actually took pictures here. But that same summer, two, we presume, gentlemen, Hodgkinson and Butters, came here and spent quite a bit of time. I've got a list. St. John, late 1841 to summer of 42. So that's probably 6-8 months. And they actually taught some other practitioners, we will mention in a minute. They were in Fredericton, September to October 1842, question mark exactly when they left. Then they were in Pictou in November, Charlottetown from December 42 to 1843. And then recently, one of them was discovered in a newspaper in Brooklyn, New York in October 1843. But beyond that, we don't have any other record of them. But they were an interesting pair. I don't want to get into, it's going to take too long, but they had an interesting time in Charlottetown because they tried to come back around Christmas time after the freeze up had started on Northumberland Strait, which happens every year. But it was so dangerous, treacherous. One of them got frostbite on their hands. They had to return and wait till the spring. But while they were, when they were back, this is an early record of one of the first daguerreotypes of a known Atlantic Canadian. Black Sam, and what's interesting, he was an ordinary person as opposed to someone of wealth. He was a member of a Black community in Charlottetown, And I'll read what it says. I don't think you can read that probably that well. A likeness of the celebrated individual who was one of the oldest inhabitants of Charlottetown, having been by subscription taken by the daguerreotype process, may be seen at the store of Mr. Henry Hazard any day between the hours of 10 and 2 o'clock on the payment of 9 shillings or more by one or pence, I believe, for person for each person. So you would pay to see it, and they were actually raising funds. The proceeds will be appropriated for the benefit of poor old Sam himself. So quite an interesting backstory, one can only imagine, but an interesting use of photography as a for charity. Now we're looking at okay. This is I'll just move on. Like a little confused with my own stuff here. So I mentioned our friend William Valentine. Here he is in November 1841, offering to make daguerreotypes. So he was a portrait painter who decided to get into daguerreotypes. He actually we've discovered pretty certain there was some earlier thought that he had gone to England or to France to learn the process, but it's much more likely, almost certain, that he actually went to Boston. And it was while on his way back from Boston that he actually stopped over in St. John for about a month around Christmas time, 1841, and began to offer make daguerreotypes. The unfortunate thing about a lot of these early daguerreotypists is they never very few of them left a record of their work, but very few of them actually signed their work. So you don't see a stamp or anything like that to actually say this is by so and so. And Valentine is one of those. The following month, he was back in Halifax, where he usually worked, and here he announces the opening of a studio, which was in his house. It says miniatures executed. Well, actually, he's miniatures executed in the best manner in latest improvements and put up in neat Morocco cases from $5 to $8. That was a lot of money. The price went down very quickly afterward, but and he's offering for inspection several specimens of this novel and highly interesting art. But he's still offering to make portraits in oil because the supposition is that he felt he really had to. He saw this as the future, and there's some supposition again that it was probably Valentine himself who was the fellow who actually made the print, the sun print that happened a year or two earlier, and that he was probably waiting a little bit for the process to improve. By the time he came along, that the necessity of turning your head to the camera had disappeared, and the quality of images changed considerably. These are two of the one on the right we know, a woman named Jane Fairbanks, and she died in 1856, very early. They're both supposed by different analysts of being by Valentine. They kind of look painterly in the opinion of one person, and in this case here, someone very relaxed looking, which would probably be representative of the work of an artist as opposed to a photographer more worried about technique, if you will. The first roughly dated and known subject was made probably here or maybe in St. John. This is actually the future Sir Leonard Tilley and his first wife, Julia Ann Hanford. And this is in the collection of the Library and Archives Canada. If you know Joan Schwartz, she informed me recently that she was the one who acquired this picture on behalf of Canada for their collection. And she suggests that the date is 1843 to 1844. She was married, I believe. They were married, I believe, in the May of 1843. And the way she's holding her hand suggests that she's pregnant. So it was probably somewhere after that, but not on the wedding day itself, although that sort of thing has happened. Another one, a photographer, a daguerreotypist I mentioned earlier as an artist was this gentleman, John Stephen Clow, who was he both participated with Valentine and was a competitor to Valentine in Halifax. There it says, picture painter begs to invite an inspection of specimens of the above art. So he's done the same thing. He said, I've got to go with the flow, so to speak, and embrace photography, which he did. And to such an extent that the photograph you see of him was not contemporary. That was taken much later. He ended up moving to the U.S. and finally settled in San Francisco. I believe this was probably taken in the Midwest, maybe in the well, it's an ambrotype, so we can date that to probably the 1860s. So now we know what he looks like. So he was in the business for many years afterward, but he started in Halifax. I believe that was his first ad, 1847. No, I'm sorry, his first ad, but the first ad was in 1842. So very early, about the same time that that Valentine was around. Now, another individual, we don't have a picture of Thomas Coffin Doane, which is kind of unusual because he was so prolific. But he was from the southwestern Nova Scotia area. He called himself a professor of daguerreotype. And he probably learned from Valentine. As you can see that he's actually working with Valentine. And this is the first foray into Newfoundland. And Valentine and Doane are talking about setting up rooms at the Golden Lion Inn in St. John's in March 1843, very early. Now, Doane, what I find impressive about Doane is what he did once he left town. In 1845, we find him in Hamilton, Bermuda, offering to make daguerreotype likenesses. The Bermuda Gazette is available online, so it's interesting to read it. You can see who is coming and going there. He found a window when there was nobody else there, so he really cleaned up. And I know that because there's a minister, an Anglican minister who was trying to raise funds for a church, lamented to his parishioners and said, within a very few months, upwards, it is said, of 1,200 likenesses have been taken in this island by the daguerreotype, and the artist, it is believed, has carried away with him many hundred pounds. And just by the evidence of no other advertisers being around, one can be pretty certain that that was our Mr. Doane. Now, Doane ended up taking his work to Montreal, where he found patronage to some of the more important people in the culturally. This is Lord Elgin, dated 1848. These are other quite famous images. These are all in the Library of Archive of Canada. The one on the right is actually a colored daguerreotype. Very delicate work. I haven't got into the process yet, and I will. But to actually add color to a daguerreotype surface was very, very delicate. And it was actually a powder that they would use, dabbed on with a brush. And, the one on the right shows Saint-Jean-Baptiste participants. The one on the left has been sometimes called the first spot news photograph made in Canada. It shows the Molson Brewery after a fire. And it's actually, okay, I'm just going to mention that it's a half plate daguerreotype. Keep that in mind because I'll talk about different plate size in a minute. And here's one of the premier of Nova Scotia, Joseph Howe. Now, we know that it's Joe Howe. This one doesn't show the mat on it. The mat is stamped by Doane. And he was one of the few who actually stamped his work. The Nova Scotia Archive, or excuse me, Nova Scotia Museum, which has it, dated to 1855. Doane was already in Montreal by that time. And so I'm suspecting that it was probably earlier than that, but I don't have any more proof. There was another New Brunswicker in Montreal, or excuse Quebec City at that time. And this is actually not a daguerreotype. It's a later image, but I just wanted to point out that there was some wonderful work being done there by George William Ellison, who was from the St. John River Valley area. In Quebec, the studio of Ellison and Co. produced elegant portraits notable for simplicity, directness, and power. That's recently written in the Canadian Encyclopedia. So that was dated 1861, still within our time frame. And another who showed up there was, here's Robert Fallis, again, an artist who has decided to embrace it. He is working in partnership with a gentleman named Mellick. I believe it was George Mellick. It was a fairly short partnership. The date here is December 1846 to January 1847, over the Christmas season. Doan left the partnership, but Mellick carried on a little bit. And I'm going to mention toward the end a fellow named George P. Roberts, who was an important Canadian photographer. Mellick would be an uncle by marriage to Roberts, and I'm guessing probably had some influence on his career. Now, what we have here is I'm looking for the next, oh, here we go. A Fredericton gentleman named William Fisher. He was he had an important role in government, but in 1848 he was trying out daguerreotype photography, and he's important historically because he actually kept a diary of his work, which is copy is kept at the New Brunswick Museum. And he talks about traveling over to Charlottetown in the summer of 48. And this is actually his ad that he placed in the Island newspaper, offering to take likenesses. He had a poor time of it. It was very hot and it was cloudy, and it didn't go that well. But on his way back, he traveled through St. John, New Brunswick, or excuse me, Sackville, New Brunswick. And this picture still survives in the Mount Allison University archives. It's the earliest known landscape photograph we have in the Atlantic region. Look at it closely. Along the fence, you can see several people there standing there. Could be just children playing, but they could also be students, perhaps. This was very early days for the university. I think it was maybe about 3 or 4 years old at that point. In another early daguerreotype landscape, Nova Scotia landscape created by this photographer, Daniel J. Smith. This shows St. Paul's Church in Halifax. That church, that view, almost that same view, can still be seen today. That church was actually built or erected in 1749, the year Halifax was founded. It was built by prefabricated in Boston and brought up and placed there. Now, if it looks like the fellow is doing what nature calls, I think that's exactly what's happening. And I'm almost certain, because that picture was reused recently where he doesn't exist, and I think somebody felt they needed to censor it. So kind of interesting at this day and age. But I just mentioned William Alexander Smith. Does that name ring a bell, or the Amour de Cosmos? He was the second premier of British Columbia. He was a brother of Daniel, who we just saw, who learned daguerreotype process and went west with the gold rush, which happened in California in 1849. There's an awful lot of photography of the gold rush. I'm sure a lot of it is William Alexander Smith. Again, virtually none of the photographers that are out there, and there were a lot of them, signed their work. So and so we have no idea exactly which would be attributed to him, and it's rather frustrating. Where were the photographers working by that time? The late 1840s. This would be the major centers that when you start looking where who the photographers were, where they were active. St. Andrews, St. John, Fredericton, Chatham, Charlottetown, Pictou, some places that are fairly small now in relative sense, Windsor, Halifax, Liverpool, Yarmouth, Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, and St. John's, Newfoundland. All of them except Fredericton having a coastal setting, and that's why the picture up in the corner there. The steamship was what made it possible, especially for itinerant photographers, to get from place to place. And that was in the early days. Itinerant photographers were quite common. And of course, Fredericton, as the capital, was served, as I mentioned earlier, by the steamship at least as early as 1825. So that's why it's the only inland location that you would see. Moncton, Sydney, Nova Scotia, Truro, all developed after the railway came in. I just find that useful to have in mind when you're thinking about where a picture might have originated from. And again, in terms of my research, I found more than 90 daguerreotypists in the region. Some names that you haven't heard of, haven't heard me mention: A.L. Whitman in Yarmouth, John Jury in Charlottetown, Thomas Ellison, that's another of the Ellison family, in St. John. W.H. Rullifson, he was in Harbour Grace. I'll talk about him in a minute. Salteri is in Halifax, and it goes on. Toussaint, Charles Toussaint, who became a doctor, he was in St. John's. Rullifson was an interesting fellow. He was from the St. John River area, from Loyalist descent. He became one of the most prominent photographers after a foray in Newfoundland and here along this in Fredericton, St. John, and over in Newfoundland, in San Francisco. He was in partnership with a fellow named Brady, was president of the American Photographic Association back in the day, and is quite highly revered. He was actually associated with Edward Muybridge, the fellow who did the early experimental photography with motion. So I've been following where some of the photographers went, as well as the ones who were working here. So Rullifson, one of the important ones. And I had to share this one. This is J.J. Deeren, again in St. John's, Newfoundland, who also practiced dentistry at the same time. He will offer extracting, plugging, cleaning, and fitting with pure mineral teeth, either by pivot or spring. And I can't tell you exactly how that process worked. This is a graphic showing the kind of the rise and fall of the daguerreotype process. An immediate rise in 1840. This is in North America. It's based on some work by a gentleman named Sean Nolan of Oregon. And the rise, an early experimental phase from 40 to 45, and then a peak at 45, 46, and a very high peak at around 1840, 54, 55. And what you see happening is another process coming along called the ambrotype, and I'm going to move into the ambrotype in a minute. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of sense of what it is we're looking at when we're looking at a daguerreotype. These are some examples. The one on the right is this is another known person, Henry Chubb, in the New-Brunswick Museum collection. There's some speculation about who the photographer is, but we're not certain. A couple of others in my own collection. The three gentlemen, I believe it's Nova Scotia, mainly because they're wearing tam o' shanters, Scottish feel to them. In Europe, they didn't mount the pictures this way, so we can pretty well tie this type of mounting in the wooden frame that we talked about for early miniature prints, miniature paintings to North America. They were often framed in a different gold-colored mat in Europe. And another one on the right, just because of provenance being in this region. So the daguerreotype, the The plate was a metal plate, usually copper, coated with silver, and the silver was through a process I can't tell you a lot about, but basically they would fume the plate with iodine and bromine vapors, creating a light-sensitive plate called silver iodide. It became what was called silver iodide, and that was exposed in the camera. And the plates came in were made in this size, but they could also be cut down. So that's a full plate, 6.5 by 8.5 inches. You could cut it down, and then you had a half plate. You cut it again, and then you have a quarter plate. And then you could take the same size plate, and you'd have a 6th plate. And then 9th plate, they got smaller and smaller. And the smallest was a 16th plate, which was basically a little over by an inch by inch square. The same process was required to make a plate, but it was cheaper, of course, the smaller it got. And sometimes when you got down to a small plate like that, you might put the image into a brooch or something as a keepsake. I'd like to go through just a bit of the anatomy of the daguerreotype. I mentioned the plate, and let's take it apart, and I'll show you what these things look like. This is with the case removed, and you can see that there's and the mat. There's a bit of tarnishing going on here. This is actually the way this picture was acquired, was without any mat. Well, the mat which I just took away was with it, but it was not cased together, and so it's suffered 170 years of patina, but also a lot of scratches and so forth. One of the interesting things that you can do with a plate, though, is you can see where it was made. This is the pattern of these are silver makers marks, and it's known to be a French maker. The 40 means it's the ratio of silver to copper, but the actual maker has never been identified. It's understandable that it would come from France, because that's where the daguerreotypes process originated. But there were other North American makers. But generally, it was supplied by the photographer. Now I'm going to show how it's put together. You have your plate. You put your mat over it. You put glass over that. You tape it. This is a very important part. They use a tape with probably a wheat or a rice glue that dried very airtight. Basically, is the point. They understood silver, of course. Silver tarnishes, and so that was what you're trying to do, was to seal the image from tarnish. And remarkably, and you're going to see an example in a minute, it worked really well if the seal was not broken, or in the case of this, if somebody took it apart and never put it back together, which I was able to do. And then it was put in a case. In the case, that's how you carried along, with a case that looked like the same, more or less, front and back, that you could put in a pocket or a purse or something like that, but it kept it protected. I think there may have been some worry that the light would hurt the image itself, but the daguerreotype process wasn't subject to fade. It was subject to tarnish. There were other cases that were used. I've got some examples here. The first one is the type that we just saw, which is a two folds, or two sides fold together, usually velvet on one side and the image on the other. Sometimes you could have a pair that face one another. As you can see, the one that's open is like that, but that's a different type, and I want to show you that. That's called a union case. The first one is made of wood, and it's either covered in a paper that's been colored, or leather. And it's the hinge that opens with is made of that same material, paper or leather. So it's quite fragile. But the next one is the union case, is actually made of a unusual material. It's a mix of shellac and sawdust that's heated up and can be pushed into a mold. And it's technically understood as the first thermoplastic ever used. And it has the feel of plastic. It has the, I mean, the detail on the surface of one of them is really, can be really quite remarkable. It's all how much effort the artist wanted to put into the mold. But these, the union case could be have a picture on one side or two, as you can see in this example. And the other case is 3 is a different kind. It actually is designed to resemble a book. It's actually made mostly of wood, and it is always designed for 2 pictures. One, they sit back to back inside. You open it up, and the unfortunate thing is the pictures don't face one another. They face away from one another. So if it's a couple, they're never looking at one another, so to speak. They're always facing away. It wasn't quite as popular, but as you can see, it's quite beautiful. It's using mother of pearl as some of the decorative elements on it. So we're moving in well into the time frame here. In 1854, Nova Scotia had an industrial exhibition that year. And this is the province house in Nova Scotia, showing a tent on the grounds. Just a block north of or behind this building was what's called the Grand Parade. It's an open square, and vendors showed up there. And there was a photographer from the Annapolis Valley who came. His name was James Margison, and we have an example of his work that's dated 1854. So it's almost certain that it was probably made during this event. Margison ended up staying in Halifax, and here's an example of a much later image by him from 1895, showing a delivery van, and that's of course using a much later process. And an interesting example that was discovered fairly recently from Charlottetown, dated 1855 to 1856, Corps of Volunteers. And there's an article that was written about this in Island magazine in 1997, where it talks about the discovery and the identification of what was going on here. And they even were able to identify the house in the background, to such extent that they also determined it still exists. So kind of fun. Another interesting identified photograph from this period, 1855. This is also in the Library and Archives in Ottawa. A group of merchants by Wellington Chase, who was a Maine-born photographer who spent a long career in Halifax. You'll see another of his pieces in a minute. And it's as a daguerreotype, I guess what's striking about it is the clarity. This is probably a full plate image. So that's how you can get everybody into one picture. That's how you often size them. They didn't have zoom lenses. They could move the camera back and forth. So he was probably quite back in the room to get the picture. But the fact that everyone's sharp and it's a brilliant photograph, and that everyone is known is also important. You see right in the middle, sort of the most formally dressed gentleman is L.E. Barker. His name was Loring Baker, who was a prominent in the early tourism and resort development in Yarmouth, not long after this picture would have been made. So I want to take 3 excursions, just little sidebars as we go through this. And the first one is looking at a certain aspect of early photography in general, and it's called stereographic photography. This is a stereographic daguerreotype. Stereography. Have you ever looked at one of the old stereo viewers? And if you look, it usually has 2 pictures that look very similar to one another. You look through the viewer, and you can bring the 2 pictures together in your mind's eye and create a 3-dimensional image. Well, that's what this is showing. This is an example of one that hasn't suffered much tarnish. I guess that's why it's striking in that way. But the other point about it is it's by a gentleman named Marsters. Now it says Baltimore, so it was made in Baltimore. But Marsters came from Nova Scotia and ended up working in St. John later. So I claim it as our own. But what's kind of interesting is the way it's cased. So there's the work. He was born in Windsor, spent about 12 years in Baltimore, spent a little bit of time in Virginia during the Civil War, American Civil War, and then ended up in St. John in 1865. The case is interesting. It folds down and then it folds out. So it turns into a stereo viewer. And that would be one of probably the first stereo photograph viewer that was invented. There was a later viewer that was for paper mounted stereos, but the date on this is 1853, I believe, and quite unusual. But it became a real not fad, but a real trend that's paralleled the rise of so much of photography. And one of the early players in that game was from Fredericton. George Stacey, or worked in Fredericton. Not very long. He was here for less than a year, I would say. Yeah, December 56 to about October 57. Does that sound about right, Josh? What?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And Josh gave a presentation about Stacey that's online, and points out that some of the earliest photographs of Fredericton were by him. Here's one from the archives showing the cathedral. Another one showing the government house. And here's what's believed to be a photograph of him in later years. He did not spend a lot of time here. Again, left an important record, but had a big career as a stereo producer. Now, I haven't found the actual advertisement, and Josh, maybe you have it, but we have the text of it. It says something new just received at Stacey's Ambertype room, and this was in July 57 in Coy's building over Lamont store. That's where he always was. All his ads comment on Coy's building, and there were other photographers who also worked there. But we don't, as far as I know, we don't know any of his pictures for certain. From this area. We do know the closest he came here was about 3 years later, after he had established himself as a stereo picture producer. And this is what they all look like. They're this shape. They're basically you have either two cameras or two lenses slightly separated with either a single plate or two plates that will capture simultaneously the same view from a slightly different angle that are mounted together and are viewed in the special viewer. And this is the Prince of Wales during his visit. We're going to come back to the Prince of Wales a little later, because he had an important visit through here, but he also was down in the US, as in Portland. But that's the closest one we have. But there's another intriguing one, and this is in the collection of a private collector showing Government House again, which looks like it might be him. I guess one of the problems is there may be another player. There was a fellow named David Lawrence who was also around at the same time, 1861. Could be him as well. Would you like to comment on that, Josh?
Yeah,
okay.
It's pretty.
Yeah.
One of those two guys.
It's one of those two guys. Now we're by the 1860s, we're in a period of transition from the daguerreotype to ambrotype process. And I've got 3 examples here that if you weren't holding them, you probably wouldn't be able to tell which was an ambrotype and which was a daguerreotype. It says right there ambrotype, so you know the one on the left is an ambrotype. But when you get to know them, there is quite a bit of difference. The technique is completely different. Basically the daguerreotype is on a silver plate, so you actually have to look at it at a certain angle to get the picture. Somehow they work well on a scanner. The scanner is the best way to look at one, seems to me. Except that they also are, some people used to call it the mirror of memory, because you are looking into a mirror and you're looking deeply into it. And the clarity, if the picture was well photographed, the person was not moving, the sharpness can be remarkable. And it's not like modern film, where there's actually a resolution that disappears at a certain point. You can keep going deeper and deeper into the image and still see, you might start to see hairs if you scanned it well enough. The middle one I added there because it looks like an exterior shot. You can see a much softer background, and which makes it kind of interesting. But the main difference in the process is that you're now using a collodion positive process, and you're saying, what's that? Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but it is quite a bit different. I'll just show you the period that we find the ambrotype, starting at about 1844, just experimental, but jumping very quickly within a couple of years by about 1858 becoming dominating the process. And this happens to coincide with the American Civil War and the beginning of actually fading off by the time Confederation has happened in 1867. So it was a very short window. But here's some examples of some ads. We see again Earl Ellison is still at play here in St. John. Thomas Barber in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. The one over here, Alfred Elson, and it mentions the opposite, the Catholic Cathedral, Great George Street. He was in Charlottetown. And then we have a fellow named Oxley in Nova Scotia, and I'm going to bring him up again in a minute. Here's a couple other, another example is, here's our David Lawrence here in Fredericton. And kind of a rare bird, a gentleman named John McCausland here in Fredericton, who was, that's about the only ad I've seen of his. He died. This is 1856. He was a watchmaker, according to the census of 51, and which may have included jewelry. A lot of watchmaker jewelers also got into early photography for. I guess it's about process and small pieces and all the sort and so forth. It seemed to work well with what the kind of work they were doing. Anyway, McCausland mentions here that he took about 6 months getting to know the ambrotype process and was ready by July to actually start offering it. How long he continued? Well, actually, I know that this actually is dated July 1856, but the ad itself was published in December. So it was at least six months that he was working. But he within 3 or 4 years he had passed away. So if there's quietude after the end of December, it may be that he came upon a disease might have attacked him, something like a tuberculosis, which was quite common at that time. So, but he was one of the early ones as well. Again, none of these people put their names on the work, so we don't know. I found this a really interesting piece of ephemera. It's a card that survived at the Colchester Historium in Truro, Nova Scotia. Our friend Oxley here, Alex Oxley, who was quite busy for quite a while, It's advertising his daguerreotype car. He was an itinerant, and he had a probably a wagon that he had taken up to Truro, called it a car, and was offering to make daguerreotypes. But you can see handwritten at the top, ambrotypes, meaning that he was probably discovered he better start offering both, because people were asking for it. So this was in August 1857. And as I mentioned, the daguerreotype was on the way out. He probably knew it, and ambrotypes were on the way in. Here's an early ambrotype. Now, I mentioned that ambrotypes first came on the scene in 1854. That's the date that the Nova Scotia Museum put on this one. And that's also in an early history of photography, Canadian photography, which also gives the date 1854, meaning he was very much ahead of his time to be that early. That's you can almost recognize that scene in Halifax today. And then another early one, which interests me quite a bit, it's in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Again, it's not in the Library and Archives collection. The reference is Library and Archives, but I just established this week. I said I had seen it described as a cracked daguerreotype. Now we've just established that daguerreotypes were made of metal; they wouldn't crack. I believe it to be an ambrotype. But the Library and Archives of Canada don't actually own it. They own this picture of it. So somewhere the original may or may not survive. But it was given to, the picture was sent to the archives way back in 1897 as by an historian, a Yarmouth historian, for what's it called, copyright purposes. And that's how it has gotten there. So where it is now, it may be in a private collection in Yarmouth. I don't know, but it would be quite a remarkable piece. It is remarkable because it shows very early scene, outdoor scene, but it also shows two people in ordinary setting. And they're probably, it looks almost maybe European, and I think that probably were Acadian girls. And in the Yarmouth area, there's a fairly large, sizable Acadian population. I may be wrong on that, but that's my supposition. Now, this one is, again, just to show you a little bit of the anatomy of the ambrotype process. Again, the case looks very similar to a daguerreotype and earlier to the miniature painting, but it comes apart differently. What you have is basically two parts, two layers of glass. The glass has the negative, and I'll talk about the negative in a minute. And behind it is a black or a dark color. That's the simplest way. So the emulsion, I should call it the emulsion, because basically it's easy to show it this way. It's a negative that has tone to it. It's a gray tone, and so you can see it looks like a negative here, but when you put it with a black background, that you see there, it comes out as a positive. And so that was the great discovery in that particular process. But it's using what they call a collodion, which is a chemical that's applied to the glass plate and is sensitized. It's called a wet plate process. That sensitized collodion is placed in the camera and exposed, and then it's brought into the dark room and fixed, as they call it. So it'll become permanent, and then that sensitized plate is placed over a dark background in the case, and that gives you your photograph. There were another number of variations on it, but that's the simplest way it was done. Some of them could be quite beautiful. This is one that's a known individual from Halifax, Mrs. Thomas Crisp. one of the ways they were sold, you can see how dark it looks. There is a darkness to them just because of the fact that you're working with a negative that has some tone over a dark. And so they often describe them as looking like a mezzotint. And if you're familiar with mezzotint, they often it's a type of engraving that often has a slightly dark quality to it just by necessity. It's layering ink, or not layering, but it's using a lot of ink. So we'll pass on that. I want to show another one that interests me. I think it's from Halifax. It's one that is marked. It says Tapley and Clark. I know there was a photographer named Tapley in Halifax, and I know there was a photo engraver in Halifax named Clark. But I haven't, the only thing that puts those two names together is that plate. And I can't, I'm still working on that one to see if in fact I can tie them working together. It's hard to explain. I don't have any images to show here, but what's interesting about that particular ambrotype is that the negative is on red glass, known as ruby glass, and it's not obvious there. It looks black, but that black is actually you're seeing the glass. Basically it's because it's housed in a case like that. There's no light behind there, very little light behind there, and so it comes out as black, very dark red. But the nice thing about the ruby glass, as opposed to some of the other methods that they use to get the black background, sometimes they would paint it with they call an asphaltum, which would flake off. And this doesn't flake because it's part of the glass. So if you see an ambrotype that looks really crisp, and it's probably a ruby glass ambrotype. Another excursion I want to talk about, I mentioned the daguerreotype car, which was probably a van. It was a way for photographers to go to a place to be there temporarily. And you can go to the Wikipedia, for example. You can see lots of pictures of these photo vans. I don't have a picture. I want to focus on this story today, but they would carry all of their equipment because there was a lot of equipment in what they call wet plate photography, and so the easiest thing was to create a vehicle that can move around. And so this is a story that sort of is told in the Liverpool transcript, another wonderful resource that's available online through the Nova Scotia Museum. Nova Scotia Archives, and it talks about a St. John photographer named, a Yarmouth photographer named R.B. Streeter, who had a photo saloon, as he called it, built in Yarmouth, and it describes it as what's it say? It's going to be at the corner of Main and Court Street, opposite Seeley's new building, where it will be ready to accommodate those wishing ambrotypes with pictures by the artist, unsurpassed. In May, it talks about the fact that they're actually moving it up into Queens County. So Liverpool is in Queens County on the southern end of Nova Scotia. So they're going up into the farm country. As you probably know, most of the population in the region at that time was rural, and so you often had to go to the customer, and that was one of the reasons for the itinerants. So it says we're going to be in Middlefield, and then Greenfield, and I think somewhere it mentions Middleton or Milton, and some of those are fairly small communities, probably were then and certainly are now. The next we find that a photographer named A.M. Saunders / Sanders, and I can prove it was both, because here's two ads talking about the same thing as Ambrotype Saloon, AM Saunders, AM Sanders. It's just what happened. But Sanders was a partner with a fellow named Durland, Joseph Durland in St. John, New Brunswick. And in 1857, they advertised ambrotypes in color, something new and beautiful, and mentions them being at Foster's Corner. And in this ad that shows up in September, October that year, this would have been published probably early in the year as the business directory. But so Saunders or Sanders has come to St. John and has taken over the daguerreotype saloon that was established by Streeter. Streeter has moved on, but he mentions diaphanotypes. And diaphanotypes are described as a color photograph produced by superimposing a translucent colored positive over a strong uncolored one. Now, if you can imagine that, you're doing better than me. But I've mentioned it to the archivist down in Queens County one time. I said, wouldn't it be interesting if we could scour get people to scour their attics and bring in pictures from the ancestors. And if we find one that has a sort of color quality to it, we could probably attribute it to this period. I particularly wanted to mention this photographer, Durland. This is an example of his work, Joseph Neely Durland. I'm going to come back to him in a minute, but you can see I don't know, are they sisters or are they the same person? They're very similar looking. This is in the New Brunswick Museum collection. It's an interesting backdrop that's got some variegation in it. But I guess what's interesting about them is in '62, we're now moving a little bit further ahead. Sanders and Durland announced that they have procured a splendid rural sketch, which they use as a background in taking likenesses. And so far as I know, it's one of the first mentions of a decorative background, which it took over in the future of through the 19th century painted backdrops. Now, I do have to backtrack. 1857, after Sanders has spent time in Queens County, there's a gentleman named S.J.M. Allen, who was the publisher of the Liverpool transcript, is mentioning that Louis Knott of Lunenburg County is offering a traveling saloon for sale. And it's described, it has a top light. That's a skylight, basically, that allows the lots of light into the studio, essential to all studios at that time. Nearly new and built of substantial and most suitable materials under the inspection of R.B. Streeter. So that ties this particular object to Streeter here. Now it's described in length or dimension, 19 feet long, 9 feet wide, and 8 feet high, fitted up with curtains, cushions, screens, carpet, etc., and handsomely painted. So now it's in Kinburn County, Lunenburg County, which is quite a ways away. It's the next county over, but it's still quite a distance to be carting along, probably some pretty poor roads, but that was intended. One of the descriptions mentions that it might be put on wheels or on a sledge, so it might have been dragged. I have what I think it might look like. Look at the description. Length about 19 feet, 9 feet wide, 8 feet tall. Excellent top light. You can see the top light. When I first saw the picture, it struck me as something out of time. It looks like maybe a travel trailer from the 1950s or something like that. With these old buildings in the background. But here we are in June 1860, and it's still for sale. Louis Knott, Mahone Bay. Who wants it? He says. Okay, it will be sold at the ruinous price of $90 if applied for at once. I'll show you. This is the picture that that was that was cropped from. This shows the Dorchester Courthouse, and it's from the New Brunswick Museum collection. This is one reason I think, to me, it's been valuable to be looking at more than one province, is that I can jump borders with ease, if you know what I mean, from a focus. My focus is can be broad enough that I might discover something like this. What would be going on in Dorchester and when to warrant someone bringing a daguerreotype saloon, not just to the community, but to the courthouse itself? Probably a big event. That courthouse doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced. Well, when I saw it, I happened to be aware of an event that might be a good candidate. New Brunswick Courier, September 10, 1864. On Tuesday last at 9:30 p.m, the last penalty of the law was inflicted upon Amos Hicks for the murder of William Hill. A very large concourse of people, male and female, gathered from all parts of the county to witness the execution. So I would think that a trial and hanging would be a good incentive to show up. I can't prove it, but that's my supposition. So if that's the case, so that's 4 years later. Was it languishing for 4 months, 4 years in Lunenburg? Well, that part of the tale is yet to be discovered. But let me just say, it wouldn't surprise me if it was the same traveling saloon. The other thing that this image allows me to do, and I'll show you the next picture as well, I'll show you how it's actually mounted. That's the full image mounted on board. So what you have is the transition from ambrotype process, which that saloon was first used for to the next process of two process. The next process, which is the collodion negative and albumen print. So the collodion is using the paper negative, that same as is used on an ambrotype, but now it's actually fully transparent, the negative. So from that, you can make a positive print using what's called an albumen process. Albumen is actually egg whites that are used as a sort of the foundation for chemicals that will become the actual print. And once you make the print, it's made on the print dimension in this example is there, and it's a very thin paper, and it's mounted onto a board to keep it stable and secure. So what you have, to me, this is an example of actually of the albumen process, but also the ferrotype process. Ferrotype was an inexpensive continuance of the ambrotype process, and I'll describe that a little bit more. But why I'm saying that is why it's all relevant here. At this point, it's possible the photographer was offering ambrotypes, but ambrotypes were on their way out at this point, and at this point, something called the ferrotype was coming along. It's a very quick process to make it a ferrotype or a tintype, it was called. And if there was a crowd of people as described in the article, he would have wanted to make as much money as he could with as many people as he could. So the ferrotype process was the way to do that, to make many pictures quickly. Whereas the paper, the albumen print that you're seeing here is a two-step process. That means making the negative and then making a print from it. And there's also drying time involved there. So this was probably made by the photographer before the rush came. He knew he had the time to do it, and probably the next day when all the people arrived, he was taking advantage of and using this newer process. That's just my theory. So here's some example of ferrotypes. They were first known as by another term, melanotypes, and melane means black. Basically, it's a sheet of metal, iron, as sheet metal, iron metal, that would be painted black. They called it Japan, and that gave you the black background that you're saying, exactly the same as you're seeing on the ambrotype. And it's a very similar process using this sort of the negative printed onto the black, or the emulsion that comes out in this sort of a grade negative that looks like a positive, and so it's called a collodion positive process. These are examples that are all believed to be from Atlantic Canada. Again, the ferrotype photographer rarely marked their work. There's one that we know of here, J.B. Davidson of Wolfville. This one is Petitcodiac Station. The only photographer I'm aware of who was active in Petitcodiac Station around this time was a fellow named William Ablett, who was English. And then this one is shown on the back as Grandma Archibald, which is a fairly common Nova Scotia name. And the other one was from the same set, I believe. So there's a supposition. And the reason I'm showing these as early examples within our time frame is the nature of the set. That fringe chair, for example, was 1860s. It sort of went out of fashion not too long after, around Confederation. And the colored mats are both fairly early. Some of them are patented, so you can tell the date. One other ferrotype I'd like to mention is this exterior view that I've acquired recently. That it's actually really quite small, but I've zoomed in on it. It actually has an oval mat like we just saw on one of the other ones, but it shows remarkable detail. And in fact, one of the it's thought to be Nova Scotia, again because of provenance, but the evidence that makes me almost certain is in the sign. Can you see the sign? Hard to see, but there's a sign over the first building here, and there it is there. Jeff, you can't read that. Well, when you stretch it out a bit, can anyone figure out what that says? Did anyone see Robert West in that picture? No, maybe I've got too much. Maybe I got too much imagination. I know there was a Robert West active in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, and that's my working theory at the moment. And when I look at the trees in the background, the white pine tree is quite specific to Bridgewater, and so I feel fairly certain about that. But that's so I want to move into the final type, and we're getting close. There's only about 10 more slides. If you're getting antsy, we're an hour and a half into it already, so we won't be long. Albumin prints, negative positive process. So this is where, as I just talked about with showing the picture from Dorchester, it really changed everything in terms of the ability to start to make multiple copies of pictures. And these are not so much ads as they are a list of photographers who we're starting to see now. This is from Hutchinson's in Halifax. You've got a raft there. These are in two different time frames of photographers and then photographers and ambrotypists. And then over on this side is in St. John, New-Brunswick, Flood and Woodburn. There's Derland again, we saw earlier. And just a few that I'll throw up. This is how the first portraits were presented. These are called carte de visite. Now, carte de visites were probably about that big, about 3.5 by 2.5 inches. And you notice the poses are all quite very similar. These two on the bottom, for example, and the one up on the upper left. And you notice the people look fairly well dressed, and it was still an expensive process. the ferrotype was less expensive. So we have examples from all four provinces. But I noticed, can you say anything unusual about the middle one of the upper top there, the J.N. Derlin St. John? It has an American stamp on it. And I can read it because it's in front of me here, but you can't read it from there. But actually, in the one on the left, that's a Derlin as well. He's in St. John, New Brunswick. And the one in the middle, he's actually in Lawrence, Kansas, which is sometimes called Bleeding Kansas at the time. There was a lot of turmoil going on in Kansas. But he moved to Kansas probably about 1865. And at the time, during the Civil War, as a tax, anyone purchasing a photograph had to pay a tax on it, and the photographer had to put a stamp to demonstrate that it was being taxed. Well, what's interesting about it's almost it's like a precursor to his moving. You can see on the far left, there's two spaces on the back of his mount. One of them shows his name, and the other one shows the shape of a stamp. And that was intended for use for an American photographer to actually put the stamp there. So now he must have bought. I'm guessing he bought them in anticipation of moving to Kansas. When he gets to Kansas, he's still using old stock. This is accepted. His new name is in the middle. But he's just putting the stamp anywhere. So it's kind of interesting to see the transition of him. I've also discovered recently that Derlin and Sanders both ended up in Kansas, and that's a surprise to me because I hadn't seen it mentioned anywhere. One of them died early, and the other and Derlin ended up becoming a veterinarian. So just like that. But that wasn't the only type of photograph that was being made. The one on the right is by Carson Flood, quite a prominent photographer in St. John. And this is from the collection at the New Brunswick Museum. And you can see it's tinted. It looks almost painterly. The one on the left is attributed to probably an itinerant photographer in Charlottetown called H.D. Monroe. And it can be dated to 1857 because it mentions the hero of cars, who was an important character, cultural character at the time. That was the Crimean War that was going on at the time. And so he would have been visiting perhaps on a speech. And so this is what you call an arch or a victory arch that was commonly used. You can see one further down in the back of the picture. That comes from an interesting book called the Bayfield Album, which is a real cultural treasure in Prince Edward Island. The person you see there, Henry Cundell, was an amateur photographer, a very early user of dry plate photography, dry plate negatives, and his friend Helen Bayfield collected his pictures and put them in an album that's been preserved. It's nearly over 100 pages of fabulous pictures, including this one here, which is attributed to Cundell. The one over here is actually the Prince of Wales, who I mentioned earlier. That was not, she collected from all different sources, but would have wanted that for her collection, and it was taken to Montreal. And I'm sure the photographers know, but I'm not aware of who it was. One more excursion, again, talking about we're now into the albumin process. This was a visitor to Nova Scotia, a remarkable man named Paul-Émile Millot, who was with the Hydrographic Survey of France. France had the fishing rights to a part of Newfoundland, and they were doing hydrographic surveys there. And he was known to the captain of the ship he was a naval officer, but as an accomplished photographer. And he came and made some substantial series of photographs in Newfoundland and in Cape Breton over a 2-year period, including this one here, portrait of 3 Mi'kmaq woman. about 1859. And these were acquired in the 80s, several pictures, I believe, from France by the Library and Archives Canada, really important cultural pieces. And the another one here is French sailors among the rocks. I mean, it's kind of a strange picture. It's not really explaining anything. It's more asking questions. And some of the pictures were obviously for his own use, and this looks like an example of them. Why do they need help carrying something on the top of a very short rock? And here's another one. Here's a picture of another rock somewhere with the word album printed on it and being painted on it. There's several characters in the picture if you're able to look at it closely. The guy standing at the top. And it's thought that he had intended to album just like the Bayfield album, but he had his own special cover picture for it. What's interesting with cultural artifacts like this is what they can inspire later. And what this one inspired was a book. There was a gentleman in Newfoundland, 2018. This book by Matthew Hollett came out, called Alvin Rock, Looking Back Through the Lens of Paul-Émile Mio. And he looks at the photograph and several of the others and tries to discover where that picture was actually taken. And he found it. So the next big event, again, the royal visit of 1860 of the Prince of Wales, who would have to wait about 40 years for the Queen Victoria to pass away. But the first one is actually an engraving made after a daguerreotype. I believe it's I always see it referred to as a daguerreotype, but now that I think about it, couldn't have been, or was unlikely to have been. He took these photographs to England and had them engraved and colored with the intent of making some money off them back home. It got a bad review from an elected official who thought the prince was not well pictured. Well, I can hardly see him to begin with, but anyway. So I'm not sure how well they sold after that. It was a bit of a fiasco. This picture was taken by Carsten Flood in St. John's, showing the Prince of Wales entourage traveling on part of the way on the new railway that had opened in St. John. They didn't go very far. I think they might have gone a little ways up the St. John River up toward Grand Bay. More to say that we did it rather than to get them anywhere. They didn't go to, I believe at that time, the train went all the way to Shediac. They could have taken the ferry, but they came back to Nova Scotia, I'm particularly sure. And then this was Wellington Chase, who I think I mentioned earlier, and a picture he took of the Prince of Wales in Charlottetown. That's him there. And I want to close with talk about this gentleman, this gentleman named George Rogers. The Prince of Wales coming was so significant that Rogers was one of at least two photographers who had decided to name his studio, which was just opening after the Prince of Wales. I'll zoom up. This shows Prince of Wales ambrotype over, and he often mentions over a colonial bookstore, and you can see the skylights in the picture there of his studio. This is what Mr. Roberts looked like. Yeah, that's what he looked like. 1846, he would have been when the Prince of Wales arrived, and he claimed to have started his studio at age 15. There was another photographer in Halifax named Valenti who opened a studio on Pleasant Street, which is now Barrington Street, and he called it Prince of Wales as well. What you're seeing is the back of a ferrotype and a fairly coarse a stamp was used to mark his name. Kind of hard to read, but it says cheapest something in the something. So fairly inexpensive. Roberts is significant for most significant for this for one other picture, which I'm going to bring up, but I want to show you this one just to look at this in a little bit more detail. And I'm borrowing this idea from a guy named Josh Green, who's done this more than once. It's amazing to look at some of these pictures. When you zoom in on them, you can see what looks like a carriage that either is about coming to a halt or just about to take off. Some boxes of perhaps new fancy goods for Mr. Delatorre's shop, and there's Mr. Delatorre with a telescope looking down to the harbor, perhaps. A couple of ladies shown almost ghost-like because they're moving, looking at the shop window there at the Colonial Bookshop, and it's just wonderful this what you can make in some of these early images. And so this is the picture that he is most famous for, which I think is a good way to come to the end. This is the famous Fathers of Confederation, taken in about 9:30 in the morning, November 7th. And there's I'm having trouble reading here. Let me see, here we go. The Vindicator, Charlottetown, September 7th, 1864. Yesterday, sorry, it was September 6th, delegates proceeded to Government House at 9:30 to be photographed by Mr. Roberts of St. John, met in Council Chamber at 11 and were to have been photographed in a group by Mr. McClellan of Charlottetown, but an accident prevented his doing so. So there was one picture, and it turned out to be pretty accomplished for a man who was now 19 years old. And that's where we'll leave it. Thank you. Welcome to, happy to answer any questions if I haven't exhausted you completely. Any questions about the technology used? If I can't answer you, maybe Josh can. I know he's studied a lot on the actual the papers and things that were used and so forth.
Okay, I'll just stay on the line.
Okay.
Questions for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say what a wonderful research you have there. So I have experience researching the phonograph, the early phonograph.
Yes.
And so both some of the things were like late. They are presenting this like technique and then call, visit, experience, bringing gentlemen's and women. And so I found it very, very interesting how also the announcement goes and changes over like 1948.
Yes.
First saying like come, visit, then bring your child, bring like mother, father, and the different devices. So I was thinking more like the question that I was having was like, with this in the first stages when there's 1848 and thinking how broad or possible is this for people, but then when you show the blue, it kind of brings like it blew my mind in terms of like how even when this could be a collective experience, it's still pretty much of like whoever fits in the food can go there. The rest has to wait outside to see the product,
Yeah.
which doesn't happen with the photograph, for example, that was so public that you have to be, like,
Yeah.
you could listen collectively.
Right.
So that's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they were. It was a one-on-one. They treated you nicely and all the rest of it. And so, yeah. You know, with those 9 fellows having the picture taken down in Yarmouth, did they pay 9 times the price? They probably got a bargain, I'm guessing. Other than the fact that it was a large plate and they probably charged more for that, but yeah, it's fun to trace the changes just through the newspaper advertising as well.
I've got one that people might care about, and then a bunch that maybe even don't. I'll say that. Can you contextualize it at all, Jeff, or as in like how much activity was evidently going on here almost immediately against, say, the rest of Canada? Like were we as cutting edge as you?
As I claim, yeah.
It looks like.
Well, we were right there. We were in the middle. We were, I mean, Atlantic Canada went into decline after Confederation in the 70s and so forth and so forth. But up until, relative to the rest of Canada, because a lot of the immigration started going west. But at that time, you saw the 4 newspapers, for example, Kingston. We don't really think of Kingston as a big player, but at that time it was a big player. Toronto and Montreal. Quebec City was fairly substantial, but Halifax was right up there. Certainly St. John was. So we were, we had on the Facebook history that I was doing, I was looking at the census records, and certainly our percentage of population in the 1850s and 1860s relative to the rest of Canada was quite high. So yes, we were, and we had a very strong connection, quite easy connection with the New England states, where a lot of the early how that worked, because my interest is here. Yeah. Oh, yes. What do you think? Those will be important records, but do I think there's enough of it? I don't know if it's conscious, but certainly be an awful lot of imagery, right? It may be secondary, but yeah, I don't know that it's that we're not taking. I don't think there was ever any conscious documentary work going on. There was one example in Halifax in the early 1870s. One photographer named Rogers wanted to make an advertising booklet, and he got advertisers. He said, if you put an advertisement in my booklet, I'll put a full page picture of your business on there. And that's a very important record of the early storefronts in Halifax and so forth. And in the turn of the century, there was a lot of what they call boosterism, where people were showing off their town as compared to why it was better than all the rest of the towns. And what they did was they showed pictures of the streetscape, factories and so forth. And are we actually doing that? We'll be going to probably Google if it still exists in some format. I think there's plenty of imagery, but is it keeping up? As things changes, I don't think anyone's taking any conscious effort to do that. And maybe we should be. I'm with the Heritage Trust of Nova Scotia, and I know that they've realized that some of the images they have of heritage buildings may not be as comprehensive as they thought. So even existing buildings that are threatened with demolition. Yeah. Yes. 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 Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah. And I have no idea who it might have been. It looks like it, well, based on my knowledge of the West business, he started in the 50s, and I'm guessing it was probably late 60s, mid to late 60s. Yeah. So who the actual photographer was then, I can't tell you, but interesting observation that he does seem to have the fact that he didn't wait for the guy to get out of the picture, which you'd normally expect. Yeah, he's right there in the picture. It's very. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's so cool. Yeah. 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 No, they wouldn't have been aware. Yeah, that's right. And you see old movies, of women in their big gowns and stuff like that, and that's what they wore. That these, can you imagine wearing the big hoop skirt? It's. I don't think I think it was more the wealthier class that were forced to wear those, but it was. Uh, it's. I find it really remarkable how. How they dress. And that's kind of one of the fun of it. And Mr. Delatorre here, he's got a top hat. I mean, yes, they wore top hats, just like we wear ball caps, I guess. Josh, did you have another one? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yes.
High resolution images, even the newspapers,
Yes.
which generally see a lot of stuff in the type of microfilm, doesn't look very.
Yeah.
Stuff, like it's from the originals, and that kind of makes me wonder, kind of a two-pronged question.
Yes.
Is that how accessible this material was to you for your research?
Yes.
Was a lot of the stuff already digitized by the institutions? Was it available online? Did you have to do any digitization yourself? Did you have to lean upon any of these institutions to have this work done?
I didn't. Yeah, I did ask for one. The one of where William Valentine announces his new studio in Halifax. That was the first permanent studio in Canada. What I had before that was an old microfilm scan. I think there was maybe one or two others in there, but a lot of the stuff Nova Scotia has put. There was a number of images from the Liverpool transcript, I think is what it was called, and those have been. They're digitally, they're photographs, but they're not. What they are is hyperlinked. I mean, you can't, or they're not. There's no object character recognition. You have to actually read each one of them, which is kind of frustrating, but it's beautiful quality. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, there seems to be a lot of it. The stuff that I found from Bermuda was really good quality. The Prince Edward Island has a pretty good database. The university there has the island newspapers online. Yeah, I've again, if I've asked, someone's been willing to give me the stuff. But I do admit, if I had tried to start this 10 years earlier, without the benefit of the internet was around, but it didn't have as much as there is now. I wouldn't have had nearly as much. Like many are saying, get the damn thing published, Jeffrey. I probably could at this point, but I'd probably be another 20, 25 years. I mean, when I remember talking to some people say that's a lifetime of research, but it has helped enormously being able to take advantage of things like provincial archives across the region. Google did digitize a lot of old newspapers, and up until recently, the Telegraph Journal was making its material online. There's the Internet Archive, which has been really useful, and there's the Canadiana Online, which is actually getting really good with some really nice material. If you haven't seen it, you just type in canadiana.ca, and it's wonderful. Even the Chignecto Post, from where I used to go to the archives every Saturday morning. I was doing research on the Rockport area of New Brunswick, and I'd go in there and go through. Now I could have done it in much shorter time because it's all online. So that's made a real difference. What do you call them? Directories. Library and Archives Canada have placed a lot of directories online. Again, Canadiana Online. But some stuff that I'm using was shared with me by people like Josh. So but mostly it's online, I would say. The best advice I got was go look in old directories. And again, a lot of them are online, but some of the later, more recent ones, I do find that there's a cutoff. My time frame is 1939, the year before the year that the war started, the Second World War. And I find that there's sort of, in the 20th century, there's less material online than there is from the 19th century. It seems to be, that's harder. So I spend a lot of time in libraries for that stuff, in a way, than I do on than the early stuff. But yeah, the quality of stuff, some of the images, you're putting a lot of high quality stuff online, good high resolution stuff. New Brunswick, like that, this one right here is New Brunswick Museum. I'm surprised it's as good as it is, because sometimes the stuff that they've put on is not their best stuff. It's all their material, but it's not always as high resolution as you'd expect. But that they have it if they want, if I needed it. So yeah, that's what's out there. You can get stuff like that out there, but you sometimes have to dig for it, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Glad to share it.